Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Harborne Islamic Study Circle HISC Seerah session 113. It's alhamdulillah our 11th session on the Battle of Uhud. So this week and next week inshallah we'll do some of the lessons that we can learn from the Battle of Uhud and some of the other important aspects around the Battle of Uhud. But before we carry on, just want to say Eid Mubarak to everyone. Hope everyone had a fantastic Eid and a fantastic Ramadan. Obviously, sad to see it go, but time passes just like that. But inshallah, let's make dua that we can carry on the benefits of Ramadan into the coming months, and hopefully, inshallah, through to next Ramadan as well, if Allah allows us to live that long. So Eid Mubarak everyone. So just as we're going to do the lessons and the things that we can learn from the Battle of Uhud, I think it's important just to recap, because it's it's 2-3 months since we started the Battle of Uhud, just to quickly recap some of the main aspects of the Battle of Uhud and how we got to where we are now, and as I say, a very brief recap, and that will help us frame the session in terms of the lessons that we can learn. So certainly going back a year prior to Uhud, obviously at the Battle of Badr, the Muslims were convincing in their victory and their rout and their killing of the senior leadership of the Quraysh. That was, as I say, an unresounding success. That really hurt the Quraysh, and they started planning for another battle soon after the Battle of Badr. But the thing that made it come to the fore more so was the raid of Zayd bin Haritha. We talked of that because of the northern trade route from Makkah up to Syria, passing via Medina, was compromised because of the Muslims in Medina. They thought, well, let's go eastwards and go via sort of towards Iraq and then double back to Syria. And then Prophet ﷺ, he found out about that. Again, somebody let slip of that route, and the Prophet ﷺ dispatched Zayd bin Haritha to get those spoils. So the Quraysh got extremely desperate, because this was their lifeline that was being choked, and the Muslims had already attacked them on one of their trade routes down south, and that was again just prior to the Battle of Badr. So then they mustered up 3,000 men, and a couple of other tribes had also joined them in the fight. And in these 3,000, they had 700 people who were fully armed. This is the Quraysh, and they had 200 horses that were part of their army. So that's 700, 200, and that's pitted against the 700 Muslims, of whom there were only 100 in armour and no horses amongst the Muslim army. But the Prophet was tipped off by Zayd bin Haritha that they were preparing, and then this is the size of the army as they'd left, and when they'd left. So Ibn Abbas sent his servant to go as fast as he could. He got to Medina, gave the Prophet ﷺ the information. The Prophet ﷺ obviously accepted that information, believed it, but then he sent out his own scouts and spies to verify the news. So they travelled to see if that was true, and then the news came back that yes, it was. The Quraysh are marching double time, twice as fast as a normal army would cover the distance. So then the Prophet ﷺ, with just sort of a day to go, he gathers everyone and he conducts a shura, a consultation exercise. Where should we fight? should we fight within the bounds of Medina, where where the people of Medina have never lost, or should we encounter them on an open battlefield? Because obviously, either of these has very different strategic implications and tactics associated with that. The Prophet ﷺ and Abdullah ibn Ubay, they wanted to fight from within the city using the natural fortifications of the city and launching a quasi sort of guerrilla offensive. Whereas the youngsters who missed out on Badr, they wanted to fight outside of Medina. So then they went. So in the end, the youngsters managed to convince everyone by shouting loudest that they should fight outside. So then they were. So then it was decided. The Shura was concluded, and they marched out. Prophet put on 2 coats of armor, and then. People tried to convince him, look, no, let's fight inside the town instead. But Prophet said, no, once the Prophet's put on his armor, he has to go by and stick to that decision. This was the decision of the consensus, the Shura. So they marched out after Fajr, and then Abdullah ibn Ubay al-Salul, he, at a critical point as they're marching out, decides to slow down and turn back. And with a view to sort of further demoralizing the Muslim army, and also to define the Muslim army. And then a couple of tribes were almost going to defect alongside Ibn Salul, but Allah strengthened them, and then in the end 700 marched out. So they camped at Uhud, and the Prophet ﷺ found the right place to camp, backs facing the mountain, and then front facing Medina, in a sort of strategic enclave. And then he posted 50 archers on Jabal al-Ainain, the Mount of the Archers, with specific and explicit instructions not to leave the post whatever happens until the Prophet ﷺ summons them. So even if the vultures are picking off their meat, not to leave the post. And then before battle starts, he's sort of waving his sword. Who's going to take this sword and give it its right? Umar and others wanted it, but he gave it to Abu Dujana. Then the Quraysh tried to again cause division amongst the Muslim camp and sent Abu Amr al-Fasiq, who used to be a monk, to try and negotiate, and then he came back with his tail between his legs, and his own people chased him away. Then, as with all the battles, it starts off with a duel, and then the Muslims, they won that duel, and then as soon as the duel was concluded, the Muslims charged and dispersed the 3,000 strong Quraysh army. So the Muslims clearly won the first phase of the battle, and the Quraysh scarpered everywhere. They were nowhere to be seen. Even the women who were camped right at the back, hitched up their skirts and ran away. So the Muslims then won. When that sort of phase of victory that Allah promised was happening, the archers on the mount, they could see that the Muslims were gathering up all the armor and the booty and things. So they felt that they might miss out, and their love of this dunya, their greed, caused them to argue amongst themselves. And then in the end, 40 out of the 50 defected. Well, not defected, but they came down, from their post. They disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ, and that only left 10 archers. Khalid bin Walid, who was hiding in a ditch, he noticed that. Then with his cavalry they charged, and they took over the mount, killed all 10 of the archers that were left, and then the Prophet ﷺ's rear protection was exposed, and then Khalid bin Walid, he charged and caused devastation amongst the Muslims there. And then there was a big confusion as he's charging on that side, and then the Muslims uh, turned and started fighting each other almost, because they weren't sure who was who. And then the Quraysh that had fled, many of them had come round, or Khalid bin Walid had summoned them, and then the Muslims were being attacked almost from all sides. The other thing just to mention in phase one is the other stories, a few stories of some heroics, but also the sad assassination of Hamza ibn Abu Talib, Hamza Abdul Muttalib, who was speared by Wahshi, and who was promised freedom for killing or assassinating Hamza. So then more sort of brutal hand-to-hand fighting happened, and the Prophet had his elite guard, two of the Sahabi, Talha and Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, and 7 of the Ansar. All 7 were slain one after the other, trying to defend the Prophet. And then we also know that some angels were sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to defend the Prophet, and then some of the other Muslims started rallying around as the Prophet called them and beckoned them, to come and regroup. And amongst the bravest warriors was Amara, who was again there, defending the Prophet with her own body at times, as well as fighting off the others. So this phase, obviously, the Quraysh were victorious in that. Lots of shaheed, it said up to 70 Muslims were killed. Of them, 65 were Ansar, 40 from the Khazraj, about 24 from the Aus. There was a Jew, and 4 of the Muhajir were made shaheed. As for the Mushrikeen, it said between 22 and 37 of them were killed. Another notable thing was the Prophet, he killed someone, Ubay bin Khalaf, who promised to kill the Prophet and fatted his own horse to that end. And then we've also got other stories of the ladies helping on the battlefield. Musab ibn Umair being the standard bearer of the Muslims, him being killed, one arm chopped off and then the other arm chopped off, and then Ali raised the banner after that. And then when Musab ibn Umair was killed, Ibn Qaymiyah, he then proclaims that he's killed the Prophet ﷺ, because Musab looks a bit like the Prophet ﷺ. So the rumour spread, and that caused even more confusion amongst the Muslims and the non-Muslims. And the morale for the fight had gone down on both sides. Some Muslims even lay down their weapons. Some Muslims even went as far as saying, let's negotiate and let's ask Ibn Sulul, the leader of the hypocrites, to negotiate with Abu Sufyan. So then Abu Sufyan, he claimed victory. He's been recalled, and he doesn't know if the Prophet and the Abu Bakr and Umar are killed, but he calls out their name, and the Prophet asks the Umar to defend the name of Islam, as Abu Sufyan is gloating in his alleged victory. Then they quickly leave the battlefield, the Quraysh, and exit very quickly after mutilating some of the bodies. Then news of the defeat reaches Medina. The Muslims, they bury the shaheed, and then they go back to Medina, and they capture one prisoner of war, Azza, who is executed, and Prophet later bans mutilation of the dead body in any circumstances. And then that evening in Medina, there's lots of mourning, lots of dead, obviously, and shaheed, and people are mourning. And then we hear some special stories of some of the really resilient believers, who hear of the deaths of their loved ones, their husband, their father, their sons, and yet they stay strong as long as they see the Prophet is alive. And then that evening, Prophet sends out people to guard the entrances to Medina, and Ali ibn Abi Talib to see to make sure that the Meccans have left. And then the next morning, 70 of them go on Hamr al-Asad with the Prophet ﷺ. Here Ibn Salul wants to accompany the Muslims, but the Prophet ﷺ says no, only those who fought in Uhud are allowed to Hamr al-Asad. They stay there for 3 days, and then there is some psychological warfare or post-battle spin going on. So that's a very brief recap of what we've done over the last 2.5 months in the Battle of Uhud. And then we talked last week just about whether or not this was actually a victory or a defeat. Excuse me. So if we look at it in purely numerical terms, the number of dead, even proportionally, the number of dead amongst the Muslims is significantly higher, and they felt they were defeated, and so obviously there is that sense that the Muslims won Badr, and the Quraysh and the Munafiqeen, the Mushrikeen, they won Uhud. But if we look at different metrics, it's not so clear cut. The Meccan army, they failed to occupy the camp of the Muslims. They didn't meet their objectives. The great bulk of the army from Medina, those that were on the battlefield, despite the confusion, they showed heroic resistance, and they fought and gathered around the Prophet ﷺ and fought bravely and courageously in the end. They didn't allow the Quraysh to run after them in pursuit and completely decimate them. Rather, it was the Muslims who went and pursued the Quraysh the next day to make sure that they weren't going to come back and fight again. There were no Muslims captives or no Muslim spoils of war. But there was one prisoner of war on the Quraysh side who was executed. The Quraysh didn't feel brave or strong enough to storm Medina, to plunder Medina and capture its wealth. The goal of the Muslims was specifically to defend Medina. The goal of the Quraysh was to obliterate the Muslims and kill the Prophet ﷺ. The Muslims were successful in their endeavor, the Quraysh were not. It was the Muslims who stayed on the battlefield at the end of the day. They didn't, wander off, or they didn't, leave in haste. So they maintained that superiority on the battlefield. They didn't have that hot haste to leave and evacuate. Again, no Muslim prisoners of war. The Muslims went to Hamr al-Asad and stayed there for 3 days. And the underlying issue of the trade is still not sorted out. The Muslims still control the northern trade route. Then Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, he basically says, he gives the game away and says, as they're camped outside deciding whether to relaunch the offensive the next day, he turns around and says, look, we haven't done anything worthy of praise yet. So that's some of the things, but the Qur'an has lots to say about lots to say about the Battle of Uhud. Most of the references, 60 odd verses, are found in the third surah of the Qur'an, Ahl-e Imran, from about verse 121 through to about 179. Those verses, many of those refer to the Battle of Uhud. Inshallah, next week I'll go through some of those verses related to the Battle of Uhud and some of the things we can learn from the Qur'an about the Battle of Uhud. So just a couple of comparisons. We're going to compare the Battle of Uhud and the Battle of Badr a bit later on, but first looking at what does Allah describe as what is necessary for victory and defeat. Both topics are covered in both Surah Ahl-e Imran and Surah Al-Anfal, which was revealed after the Battle of Badr, and there are common themes around how to win a battle in both of these surahs. And the most common theme of victory and defeat is essentially victory belongs solely to Allah, not to the effort we put in itself, but victory is purely from Allah. And linked to that is the fact that if Allah wanted victory for you, it would happen so long as you depend on Him. And then he references Musa in the Battle of Badr and in Surah Ahl-e Imran how Pharaoh was defeated. It's having that total dependency on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if Allah helps you, you win, so long as you rely on only Allah. If you rely on other people for victory, you will lose. So that is a really key message, that we have to rely on only Allah for our victory. Relying on other people, relying on other states, relying on other people for victory, it's not going to be good, because we're taking away the rights of Allah in that. Attachment to this world and preferring the dunya over the akhirah will lead to defeat, and that's clear in both battles. Allah promised the Muslims victory in both battles, and He delivered victory in phase 1. But when the archers deserted their post in order to get the riches of this dunya, their love of this dunya, that's when they lost. So preferring dunya over akhirah will lead to defeat. These are lessons for us, very important lessons for us to take. Linked to the first couple of points, well, the first point, again, numbers are not the cause of victory or defeat, right? We shouldn't have that secular mentality where we think there's only 313 against 1,000, they're bound to win. Numbers in themselves are not the cause of victory, right? And an over-reliance on your numerical superiority will not guarantee victory. So victory is only from Allah. So again, it's not relying on purely your own efforts, not relying on things you do for victory, but doing the best you can and then trusting in Allah. A reason for failure is disobeying Allah and the Prophet. That is the reason why the Muslims failed in Uhud, because they disobeyed the explicit instructions of the Prophet ﷺ not to leave the mount. So by disobeying the Prophet ﷺ and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we will fail. So whatever is in the Qur'an and the Sunnah, we need to hold on to. And again, linked somewhat tangentially to that is disunity amongst the Muslims will cause us to fail. The Muslims were a united core at Badr, with one purpose, they sort of fought with one valor almost, and because of that unity, Allah granted them victory. But the disunity that they displayed at Uhud, the people coming down off the mount and people just scarpering when Khalid launched the counteroffensive, that disunity led to failure. So again, it's important that we don't cause fitna amongst ourselves in our own community. We stay united and keep hold on fast to the rope of Allah, the book of Allah, the Qur'an and the Sunnah, right? And people who deviate from that, we should be suspicious of them if they do it for their own ends, especially if it is for the sake of dunya, and we've talked about that as well. perseverance, not disputing amongst ourselves and being patient. And it's Allah mentions it in both surahs that perseverance is one of the reasons why Allah would grant us victory. Right? A steadfastness, standing firm and not turning our back. That is the reason, one of the reasons why Allah will grant us victory. And preparation is important, but we shouldn't rely on it. We do our utmost physically, mentally, economically, spiritually. We train well. We gather as much forces out as we can physically muster. But once we've done that, we depend upon Allah for the victory. So we put in our effort, and then we depend on Allah for the outcome and the victory. So it's tying a camel and putting our trust in Allah. That is clear in both battles. And finally, constant remembrance of Allah is a cause for victory. So having dhikr on the tongues all the time is very important, and Allah will grant us victory for that. And again, one of the small instances that we discussed when one of the Sahabi had his fingers chopped off, and he essentially said, "Ouch!" And the Prophet said, "Look, if only you'd said Bismillah, or some other dhikr, the angels would have raised your status there in front of you." So, it's getting to that mindset where we are constantly having dhikr on the tips of our tongue. That we wet our mouth with dhikr. So whenever anything happens, good or bad, praise of Allah always comes forth. And Allah says that constant dhikr is a cause for our success. So again, there's many rules for victory and subsequently defeat that are outlined in both of those surahs. And then linked to that, some of the lessons that we can learn, and some of the sort of moralities from the Battle of Uhud. It was, as we said, the neglect on the part of the archers of the explicit command of the Prophet ﷺ where they left their spot that caused the Khalid bin Walid to take advantage, and the huge defeat. And that therefore success of Muslims, as we said, is purely dependent on us being obedient to the Prophet ﷺ, right? And it's when we strive for worldly riches that we are bound to come to grief. We might temporarily get them, but then we lose our soul and consequently lose our akhirah in the interim, by focusing on these worldly and being proud of our worldly riches, our big houses, our big cars, our big jobs, our big whatever, by being proud of those things. Allah will test us and even punish us severely if we don't depend on Allah and are obedient to Allah in all things. It's not picking and choosing from the Qur'an. These things are good, these things are bad for us. It's actually taking things in totality. There'll be the Battle of Uhud helped clear the lines between the believers and the non-believers. We got clear demonstration of who is a hypocrite and who was a firm believer. Up until then, people suspected Abdullah ibn Ubay that he might not be sincere, but it was through Uhud that when push came to shove, the battlefield, he exposed himself. And we might not have that same physical battlefield with the enemy as such, but there are so many battles that we fight nowadays that you can see who are the true Muslims and who are those who are pretend Muslims, essentially, who don't stick to Islam, who look for the easy way out, who basically are hypocritical to the values of Islam. and they are the oppressors, they are the tyrants, they are the bullies, right? They are the people who just pride themselves in their worldly attainments. So these are the people we should stay clear of, because it's these types of people that when it comes to the crunch, we're not able to rely on. Now, if they're like this in good times, as it were, imagine what they would be like with a bit of pressure on the battlefield. When the stakes are higher, they're the first people to crumble and sell you out. Much like Abdullah ibn Ubay, leader of the hypocrites, sold out the Muslims. So the Battle of Uhud was able to expose these people, expose the hypocrites for what they really are, and there's no dispute in that. Obviously, the people who are following the hypocrites still may not get it. Their hearts are hardened and blackened, but most other people can see it when they weigh things up. So that these hypocrites, they disclose their real intentions, not just in words but also in deeds. Right? They are far from Islam. They don't look to Islam for their answers. Okay. Uhud also helped the Muslims check their pride. They thought they were invincible after Badr, but Allah brings them back down to earth, and they need to go through this period of observing full patience in extreme adversity. These trials and tests are provided by Allah so that true believers can get what they rightly deserve. So it's like Allah knows what we're like, knows what level of Jannah we can have. But in order to get the level of Jannah that we rightly deserve, we need to go through these trials and tests to prove ourselves to be able to be that much closer to Allah. And these are these trials. Also, the status of martyrdom, being a shaheed, was exemplified through this battle, and the verses of the Qur'an and the sayings of the Prophet related to the shaheed are here. And again, linked to the last point, this is a golden opportunity for people to have all their sins wiped out. This is a way in which through martyrdom, people are able to sacrifice the ultimate and to attain the highest rank, right? That's been granted by us. This is the passport to that high level of Jannah, without even the questioning, and the ability to even take 70 relatives, through to Jannah without questioning. Okay, so this is the Uhud was an event where Allah could take people who were beloved to Him and give them that high rank. And likewise, the flip side is it's a way for the enemies of Allah, right, to sow their own destruction, right, and their own annihilation, for the evils that they do against Allah and His Messenger and the Muslims. They are basically writing their own sort of death warrant for the Akhirah, right? Allah is completing the charge sheet, right, for the Day of Judgment, by allowing these evil people to demonstrate their evil, their tyranny, their oppression. They are essentially won't have any leg to stand on their judgment, because Allah will have proved how much evil is in their hearts. Another thing that we can learn from this is that it's your eagerness for a battle, or your iman in Islam, which is key. Now here you have some children wanting to fight. Kids who are 13, 14. Some of them were turned away from Uhud because they were deemed to be too young. The Prophet turned them away when they got outside Medina and said that you're too young to fight. yet they still wanted to fight. And it's not that they were afraid of death or afraid of fighting, it's that their iman was at that level. It's not that, we can claim this is a warrior society, a tribal society where it's macho to fight. No. If that was the case, Abdullah ibn Ubay wouldn't have retreated. It's not that it's the tribal warrior status that was that high. It was their people's iman, right? And Abdullah ibn Ubay al-Salul, he didn't have the iman, so he ran away in fear. He ran away from the battlefield. The youngsters, they had iman in Allah. They wanted to fight, and despite that, they were turned away. So it's not about the type of society that they were living in. And again, key to a lot of these things is what is your Niyah. You had some fighters fighting for fame, fighting for tribalism, fighting for their people. They're not going to get rewarded for that. In fact, they're sowing their own destruction by fighting for the wrong reason. And other people, like the story of Usayrim, who did very little, was a non-Muslim in the morning, did Shahada, came to the battlefield, died, didn't even pray, guaranteed one of the highest levels of Jannah. Okay, so it's key what is your Niyah in everything, right? Because upon that we will be judged. The Munafiqeen, the hypocrites, again, one of the things, they refused to fight in Uhud because they were afraid. They didn't have iman. But they wanted to fight in Hamr al-Asad the following day because they knew that either there's going to be booty or war's not likely. Okay, but either way, they wanted some worldly benefits, some gain, some pride, or some physical riches and spoils. And the Prophet said no. So here you've got people who want the gains of being a Muslim, fighting alongside the Muslims, but are not willing to actually make the sacrifices. Right? So it's like being Muslim when it's convenient, right? So people, in our day and age, they pick and choose things to appear to be Muslim, but they're not willing to actually make the sacrifices, right? Give up their mortgages, give up their interest, give up, their evil practices, for the sake of Allah, right? That's essentially the same thing. Scholars who aren't, willing to speak the truth and cover up parts of Islam for the sake of, other people, right? All of these things, it stems from the same fountain of hypocrisy, right? Where you want the gain without the so-called pain, right? So obviously linked to that, the flip side that we talked about, it is servitude and steadfastness. So the steadfastness and servitude of the Sahabi in good times and in bad times. These are people who truly humbled themselves to Allah, right? And they turn to Allah no matter what, in good times, in bad times, right? They have Allah at the forefront of their minds. These aren't people who are conditioned to turn to Allah in certain circumstances. So, for example, some people will only turn to Allah when things are really tough. Exams are coming, or there's a particular life event. Right? Things are very tough. Then they turn to Allah. Things get better, they don't turn to Allah. Like the people on the boat, right? Allah talks about in the Qur'an that in the storm they do everything they can, but in the end they turn to Allah and Allah saves them. And then when they're back on shore, they forget about Allah. Right? So these people, who are conditioned to only turn to Allah if things are bad. Likewise, there's people who are conditioned to turn to Allah when only things are good. So when things are good, we say, thank you, O God. Okay? But when things start to get rough, we start to turn away from Allah, we blame Allah, right? And then these people, again, they're fair weather Muslims, right? If that, right? So we need to be good Muslims in good times and in bad times, right? Because both of these, it's the qadr of Allah. We need to show that servitude, that steadfastness, right? And always worship Allah. Also, one of the lessons from Uhud is that this was a preparation for the ultimate test that the Muslims had to face, and the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So some of them tasted that fear of the Prophet ﷺ being gone because of the rumors in the battlefield. So Allah is using that as a preparation from the Muslims. And again, we had Abu Bakr quoting Surah Ahl-e Imran when the Prophet ﷺ actually died, and people like Umar were ranting in the mosque saying, no, he can't have died, he's not dead, right? Abu Bakr calmed everyone down and said, look, messengers come and go, they live, they die, right? And this is that psychological preparation for the Muslims, that what are you going to do when the Prophet dies? Islam is greater than any individual, even if that individual is the greatest person ever. Islam is more than that. Okay. And then another lesson we have from that, or one of the sort of morals of the story, is that the level of Uhud in what Uhud meant to the Prophet ﷺ, right? He was always very close to the Shaheed at Uhud. He was always very the martyrs were very dear to him. So much so that just before he died, he went out of town with his slave, and he made a special dua for the dead at Uhud. And then he's speaking to them and said, look, I'll be waiting for you at the fountain, and I will testify to Allah regarding you. Meet me at the fountain, right? Al-Gawfa. Okay, and this is in this last week or two, and in fact his very last sermon, his very last bayan that he gave before he died, he made reference to the Shaheed at Uhud. And again, indirectly, he said, look, I'm not worried that you will fall as an ummah, we will fall into shirk, right? He's not worried that the ummah as a whole will fall into shirk, okay, associating others with Allah. But he is worried, so I'm worried after I die, this dunya will open up for you, and you will compete with one another to get the most of it. And that's so true. And that is the reason why the archers came down and was the cause of the defeat, because of the love of the dunya. And the Prophet says, look, I'm not worried about shirk. I'm worried about your chasing after the dunya. And what I find, what I find really remarkable is that despite the fact that these 40 archers came down, they disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ, we don't have, or I've not come across it, it may be in some of the books, we don't have their names. They're not named and shamed. That and because Allah forgave them, it's never mentioned again. These, and Prophet ﷺ knows who these people, the relatives of Musa, the relatives of Hamza, these people, they know who these 40 people were. And the fact that it's they're coming down from the mountain that caused the vast majority of the deaths on the day of Uhud amongst the Muslims. Yet they're never reproached for that, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we'll talk about this next week inshallah, He forgives them. But more importantly, the lesson that we learn is that He commands the Prophet ﷺ to ask for forgiveness for them. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. these are the people that that essentially led to the Prophet ﷺ being, scarred, his teeth being broken, shot by arrows, having, pelted by stones, right? And Allah is saying, you need to ask Allah to forgive these people, right? And it just shows the beauty of Islam. And it's never, once Allah has forgiven them, it's never brought up again. It's not on their charge sheet. This is what true forgiveness is about. No matter what harm is done, if you're forgiven, it's forgiven. You don't bring it up again year after year. Every time you have a fight or a disagreement, you don't keep bringing up the same thing. That's not forgiving people, right? That's using it again and again to get at them. If you really forgive them, then you forget all about it. Just like Yusuf, when we talked about the story of Yusuf and his brothers in the well, he'd forgiven it. He'd forgiven them for that. He didn't bring it up right at the end, right? So, this is really important. Some really important lessons that we can learn from the Battle of Uhud. So I'll probably finish there. I mean, the next short section is just comparing the Battle of Uhud with, but actually no, I'll do that. I'll just take a couple of minutes. I'll zip through that. So Quranically, a comparison between Badr and Uhud, because I think next week, if I'm going to go through the verses of Ahl-e Imran related to Uhud, that'll probably take the whole session. So I'll quickly go through this. Allah says in Surah Al-Anfal regarding Badr that the one of the reasons for Badr was so that Allah can separate the filthy from the pure. And this is in translation. Here, the filthy are the Mushrikeen, the idol worshippers, and the pure, obviously, the Muslims. In Uhud, Allah uses a sort of similar attribution. Allah will not allow the believers to remain as they are until He separates the Khabith from the Tayyib, right? So who here are the Khabith, right? In Uhud, these are the Munafiqeen, right? The filthy, right? In the Badr, according to the Qur'an, was to separate the Muslims from the Mushrikeen. Here, one of the major outcomes is to separate the good Muslims, the true Muslims, from the filthy wannabe hypocrites, the Munafiqeen. Okay, Allah also says in Surah Al-Anfal that Allah wants to affirm the truth with His word and to cut off any root of the unbelievers. And in Uhud, when it was said to them, come and fight, they said, if only we knew there was fighting, we would fight. So again, it referenced to Abdullah ibn Ubay, plain out lying. He says, look, if I knew he was going to fight, we would fight. Allah wants to affirm the truth and cut off the roots of disbelief. And here is the exposure of Abdullah ibn Ubay. In the Battle of Badr, Allah showed them the dream that the army of the Quraysh was smaller, and in order to give the Muslims optimism, Allah says in translation, I showed you few of them in a dream, and if you'd seen them as they were, you'd become demoralized and you would have started fighting amongst yourselves. Thus, as a mercy, Allah avoided the Muslims bickering amongst themselves by showing them few in number. Whereas in Uhud, Allah says, look, you began to argue amongst yourselves. When you began faltering and fighting amongst yourselves, right, that's what undid the Muslims, okay? They didn't do it in Badr, Allah protected them, and they succumbed to infighting, disunity in Uhud, and that was a cause of their defeat, right? Allah said, look, I protected you from infighting, but in Uhud, you disobeyed Allah and His Messenger, therefore that protection was taken away, okay? Another thing is that Allah said about Uhud is that He tested the people through their disobedience, right? So whatever happened in Uhud, all those things then were forgiven, right? So once they'd gone through that, as we just mentioned, Allah then forgave all of those people. Even people who, even those who weren't the archers, but those who were on the battlefield, who ran away. Even people like Uthman ibn Affan, right? Who was absent at Badr for the reasons we've talked about before. His wife was ill, and then and on Uhud.